Clara sat in her apartment, exhausted from a long day at work. It was late, and the only sound in the room was the hum of the refrigerator and the faint click of her laptop cooling down. She had finally settled down to catch up on some emails before heading to bed when her phone rang. It was a strange hour, well past midnight. Clara glanced at the screen. The number was unfamiliar, with no caller ID. She hesitated. Usually, she didn't answer unknown calls, but something urged her to pick up. Maybe it was curiosity, or the strange feeling that this time it might be important. "Hello?" she said, her voice groggy. There was silence on the other end, just the faint sound of breathing. Clara frowned and was about to hang up when a distorted voice whispered, "I see you." The words sent a chill down her spine. It was like the voice was right next to her, but the sound crackled and warped, as though it had been distorted by some evil force. Clara's heart pounded in her chest. She quickly hung up the phone, hoping it was just a prank or a glitch in the network. She locked the phone and set it down on the table, trying to shake off the strange feeling that clung to her. Her mind couldn't help but race. Who would call her at this hour? She had no enemies, and her friends were all accounted for. A wave of unease settled in her chest, but she decided to ignore it and tried to go back to her emails. But just as she was about to type, the phone rang again. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she saw the same unfamiliar number. Her hands trembled slightly, but she reached for the phone, pressing it to her ear. "Hello," she said, her voice shakier this time. The same distorted voice answered. "I see you." Clara's heart stopped. She glanced around the room. The lights were on, the curtains were drawn, and everything seemed normal. Yet a creeping sensation of dread began to fill her. Who could this be? How did they know she was here? The thought of someone watching her, lurking just beyond her sight, made her skin crawl. "Who is this?" she demanded, trying to keep her voice steady. The voice didn't answer directly. Instead, it spoke in a low, menacing tone. "You're alone, aren't you?" Clara froze. The voice sounded like it was coming from inside her head, twisting her thoughts. How could they know she was alone? Her apartment was on the 3rd floor, and no one else was there. No one but her. Her fingers tightened around the phone as her pulse quickened. "What do you want from me?" she asked, trying to sound braver than she felt. The voice whispered again, but this time it was louder, almost as if it was right in her ear. "I'm waiting for you to leave the house." Clara felt her stomach turn. A cold sweat broke out on her brow. She stood up and paced around the apartment, trying to make sense of what was happening. The phone call had unsettled her in a way that nothing else ever had. It was as if the voice knew her every move. "Why don't you leave?" the voice continued, growing more sinister. "It's safer if you do." Clara's mind raced. Should she leave? Should she call the police? She couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. She hung up again, her fingers trembling, but the thought of leaving her apartment seemed illogical. Still, the fear gnawed at her. She paced around the apartment, pulling the curtains tighter and checking every lock. The phone remained silent, and for a brief moment she thought she was safe. Maybe it was just a prank after all. But then, just as she was about to sit down, the phone rang once more. Clara froze. Her stomach twisted into a knot. She didn't want to pick it up, but she couldn't ignore it any longer. Something deep inside told her this time was different. This time it was real. She took a deep breath, picked up the phone and put it to her ear. There was no breathing this time, just silence. Then, the voice, low and mocking, spoke again. "I'm here." Clara's heart slammed in her chest. She looked around the room, her eyes darting between the windows, the door, the shadows. Her breath caught in her throat as she heard the faintest sound, like a footstep coming from behind the door. She spun around, but there was no one there. Just the silence of the night. The voice continued, its words dripping with malice. "I'm watching you, Clara. You can't hide." She felt her knees weaken, and she stumbled backward toward the kitchen. She gripped the counter for support, her mind racing. Who was this? How did they know her name? How could they know where she was? Her phone buzzed again, and she nearly dropped it in her panic. This time, the message on the screen read, "Look outside." Her blood ran cold. Clara's hand shook as she slowly walked toward the window, her legs weak beneath her. She didn't want to look. She knew it was a bad idea, but her curiosity and dread drove her forward. She parted the curtains just a crack and looked out into